Hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. I'm the host of the Godcast. I'm also the vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley and I'm the author of Our Daily Bread from Argos to the Altar, a Pre-Story. My guest on the Godcast this week is Adrian Goldberg. Adrian is a writer, broadcaster, a man of many talents. Going to be learning a bit about his career and also about his new book, Where's the Money Gone? The battle for the soul of English football. So I do hope you enjoy this podcast. If you do, then do check out my site or maybe subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll find hundreds of interviews there. But for now, I hope you enjoy this interview with Adrian Goldberg. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Adrian Goldberg. Adrian is a writer and broadcaster. Adrian, it's great to get you on. How are you?
No, nice to speak to you. Great to speak to you, Alex. A real pleasure, and happy to chew the cud about the game that we both love, and so many millions of us love as well around the world, isn't it? Football's brilliant.
It is, Adrian. What was the first game you went to? Can you remember?
Man. Um, the first game that I write about, that I write with any clarity, is West Brom against York in 1975. That wasn't the first game I'd been to, but it was the first game where I found myself as a West Bromwich Albion supporter. And Albion were 2-0 up against York City, then playing their only season in what is now the Championship. And West Bromwich Albion, even though it was York City, even though it was in their only season at the second tier of English football, could not hold on to a 2-0 lead. And it ended up 2-2. And a couple of things that were interesting about that game, interesting to me anyway, were that York City were playing in their famous Y-front shirts with claret tops with a big Y in white down the middle. That's got a bit of cult status these days. And up front, West Bromwich Albion had a striker who you may have heard of, one Sir Geoff Hurst, who scored in that game one of only two goals that he scored for the Baggies. And despite being England's World Cup hero in 1966, scoring that famous hat-trick against West Germany, he was not loved by the Baggy supporters. He was clearly on the way down. And despite his goal, I remember one Albion fan shouting out, "Bloody hell, Hurst, I've seen more penetration from a eunuch trying to get past the chastity belt." And so that was my introduction to the Hawthorns. And I kind of fell in love with the place, really. And I'd been to all of the other local grounds. I'd been to West Brom before as well, but we didn't really have football in our family. And my mate at school said to me, in secondary school, why don't you come down after we played Saturday morning football at school, which was then a thing. And got the bus to Handsworth, which was very unlike the mostly white council estate that I'd grown up in. Handsworth, I'm sure people will know, is a very diverse area of Birmingham. It fascinated me. I had a bag of chips as well. And then we got the bus further up the Soho Road to the Hawthorns, and I was smitten. And here I am all these years later, a season ticket holder in the Halfords Lane stand at the Hawthorns.
It's interesting because I kind of doing very little bit of research, but you know I'm from a generation, Adrian, of the football sticker albums, and I clearly remember West Brom around three key people really, three black footballers: Laurie Cunningham, Cyril Regis, and Brendan Batson, and I remember kind of thinking this is a big club. They're a significant club. In many ways, my team is Burnley, and I think they're kind of they're very close to the area, aren't they? You may not be huge West Brom fans in Newcastle or Liverpool, but to the town, they're very significant. Is that fair? Would you say?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a crossover between the fan bases. They're two, in the best and the worst senses of the word, two traditional working class towns, aren't
Mm.
they? I think because West Bromwich is next door to Birmingham, I think that creates a slightly different dynamic maybe than is at play in Burnley. But they are traditional great football clubs, founder members of the Football League and the heartbeat really of English football. I know we talk about the elite clubs, and in my book, Where's the Money Gone? I spend a lot of time talking about the elite football clubs. But actually, the strength of English football is not the elite clubs. If the elite clubs, for some reason, did not exist or went away to play in some kind of Harlem Globetrotters style global Super League that was located in Saudi Arabia, English football would not die. Far from it. I think English football below that level would actually gain strength. And you only have to look at the attendances of things like what I think is now called the Virtue Trophy. You know, when you have teams from League One and League Two playing at Wembley in that final, or even just attendances in the Championship in League One and League Two. No other country has got that strength in depth, I don't think. No, that love for football. Maybe Scotland, to be fair, but certainly these islands have I think, the greatest passion, the greatest intensity of love for football. And that was something I wanted to tap into in the book because I think it is very easy to see football only through the prism of the big six, to see it through the prism of big money transfers. And sometimes the question is posed, well, look at what the Premier League has given to football. Hasn't it given loads to football? I'd put that the other way around. Look at what football has given to the Premier League. English football has given this great reservoir of support, of passion, this network of clubs who might generate the talent of the future. One of the things I look at in the book, and I mean, this may be germane to Burnley actually, was that, in time gone by, a club like Burnley would poach players. When I was a kid, they were famous for poaching players from the northeast of England. And West Brom also had a player from the northeast, Brian Robson, who you may have heard of. And I don't know what the clubs in the northeast of England were doing at the time, but they clearly weren't doing brilliant at recruiting their own local youngsters. The Charlton brothers, of course, who went to Manchester United. And so you look at that and you think, well, look, there is this great strength in depth here. One thing that's happened, though, and one of the things I explore, is that the traditional model of recruiting youngsters and then smaller clubs spotting the youngsters, trading them on to the bigger clubs, and thereby being able to sustain themselves. The Premier League has used its financial muscle to upend that, so that now the best youngsters are hoovered up by the Premier League and loaned out to clubs lower down the chain, so that instead of smaller clubs making money through the transfer market and being able to grow themselves, they are used as effectively training grounds for the stars of the future, as proving grounds by the Premier League clubs. It's just one of the ways in which the Premier League, I think, has upended the way that football was traditionally run, and not necessarily for the better either.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about the book more, Adrian. But again, as a Burnley fan, I've had lots of footballers on. One, I'm sure you remember the name Jamie Hoyland. Jamie tells a lovely story on one of my podcasts about how Gawthorpe used to be the training ground where Burnley play used to be this ramshackle of a place, and he tells this lovely analogy of it was like, it were rough and it were damp. He said, but it were our damp, and I really love that sentiment because it kind of that was the camaraderie of the squad and everything that Burnley meant. And now, I go on the football with my daughter, and she's never seen it so good, Adrian. Everything's gleaming, everything's perfect. And as a former referee, I used to do lots of trials matches down at the training ground. I remember what it's like. So, in that regard, money has been very good for clubs such as Burnley. Would you agree?
I agree, and of course, things change, and lots of changes for the better. My daughter who is 10, my youngest daughter. I've got three daughters, and taken the elder two to football, and it hasn't really stuck, and you kind of can't force it. That's fine. But my youngest is absolutely absorbed in football. She plays it. She loves coming to the baggies with me. The Albion do a very reasonable kids season ticket, and very, very reasonable, only £1 a game, 23 quid for a season ticket. But we also, because she plays as well, keep an eye on women's football. And we went to see West Brom women play their first match in their new home stadium, which is the Alexander Stadium, which is where the Commonwealth Games were held in 2022 when they were held in Birmingham. And of course, it's a big bowl because there's a running track around it and long jump pit and all that sort of stuff. we're watching the game a few minutes. She said, "Where's the scoreboard? Where's the board where we can watch back what happened during the
Mm.
game?" And at football now, certainly at the Albion, we've got two big boards. So, if you got your nose in your bag of crisps, if you're a kid, your dad or your mum can nudge you and say, "Oh, have a look at this replay here. There's just been a great moment that you missed because you weren't paying attention." As a kid, you and I couldn't have that replay moment, could we? You'd have to keep your eyes on the game, or
Yeah.
you'd, in all probability, when you were a kid, you would miss it. So those kind of changes to football have been absolutely brilliant. I really applaud them. I think it's great, and clearly facilities are better in many respects. They're safer, and you can, get half decent scran at the football anyway these days. So, without a question, and the fitness of the players, uh, although that may be compromised by the number of games they play, but the fitness and the speed and the kind of the nutritional levels, all that, football's a much more professional game than it was when we first started watching it. And I think below the very top level, I don't think the camaraderie has disappeared. I know footballers at championship level in League One are probably doing all right by most people's standards, but it's not so far removed from ordinary working people's lives, I don't think. So that it still feels very meaningful, which I think is the kind of the key thing about football, isn't it?
Yeah, I hold a real kind of juxtaposition with football because I mean I was at the Burnley Liverpool game yesterday and it was incredible watching such talented footballers. I thought Burnley did a fabulous job in trying to keep them out, but I also love the smell of places. We've got a lot of non-league clubs around here, Baker Borough, Padiham, Cone Dynamos. Still love the smell of the liniment oil that's been rubbed in. You can smell the drift from the dressing room. It takes me back to my old reffing days, and I really love both aspects of it. But within all that money issue, Adrian, I mean, what's your take on, when I think about some of the really big clubs that have fallen by the wayside, even going back to clubs such as Oldham Athletic, who were in the Premier League, Bradford City, Sheffield Wednesday. Is there a theme running through these clubs which has seen their downfall, or are they all kind of unique kind of uh, football calamities that have just happened?
I think they'll all have their own unique features, won't they? They'll all have their own story to tell. But I do think that in modern times, I think the desperate desire to get to the Premier League or to stay there once you are there has kind of warped football. I think if you're in the Championship or even a big club in League One, I think the temptation is to push the boat out, to spend money that you haven't got in the hope that you will get it back later when you're in the Premier League, once you have reached the promised land. Forgive me, Father, but
Nice
that's how
touch.
football
Love
fans,
it.
that's how football fans talk. And so many clubs are living beyond their means. In fact, I'd run a podcast called Where's the Money Gone? I interviewed Liam Scully, who's the CEO of Lincoln City recently. And Lincoln City try and run their club sustainably. He said, but every year at the moment, an owner has to write a check for £3.5 million, even at a club that tries to run itself sustainably.
Mm.
And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because if we were to run ourselves truly sustainably, we'd probably get relegated. No fan stands on the terraces and chants, we're the most sustainable football team in the league. So I think football has that issue of overspending. And I think it's distorted by the fact that when clubs come down from the Premier League, they get parachute payments. And you might say a degree of kind of parachute payment is sensible, perhaps, to help clubs out if they're going to hit hard times in the lower division. But the disproportionate incomes at the top encourage this incredible financial arms race lower down. And I do think that underlying the financial problems, this may not apply to every single club that has hit financial trouble, but I think it applies to a lot of them. It's clubs overextending themselves because the rewards that they see in the Premier League are just so great, and I think it warps football.
What was your take on the Morecambe situation, Adrian? Because that was that was a little bit different, wasn't it? This was just an owner that was refusing to relinquish control of the club, even though it was absolutely in free fall, and it was in everybody's interest that that happened. What was your take on what happened there?
You know what? I'd love to be inside boardrooms when that happens. I mean, it probably a very horrible place to be, truthfully. But the writer in me, the journalist in me, would love to know. But I think these things happen, don't they? Whereby owners kind of become besieged. I think there's a really interesting psychology goes on at that moment. And I don't know whether it's in some cases an owner refusing to admit defeat, because I think people who come to own football clubs generally have previously had some success in their life. They've generally built up a stock of money through some kind of business success. And yet at that moment, they have thousands of people, if they attend a game, telling them they're idiots, telling them to get lost. They'll have journalists phoning them up saying, "Have you sold the club yet?" And I think there's a pride kicks in. I think people want to prove their critics wrong. I think that there's also a financial element. I mean, at my club, West Brom, the person who fronted the consortium that owned West Brom, the Chinese consortium, was a guy called Guo Lai. And that consortium spent something like 200 million quid to buy West Bromwich Albion. Now, as we fell out of the Premier League, got back up, fell back down again, and it was clear that we were heading without significant intervention, heading down to League One, the value of that club tumbled. I mean, Lai's consortium massively overpaid for the club. And then it's worth what? 50 million, 60 million. You've got to go back and tell all the other investors, of which there were actually hundreds invested at some level in West Brom, you're not going to get your money back. So I think there's a refusal to acknowledge defeat, a natural human pride. I think there's the facing up to the hard fact that you had all this money and it's gone. So I don't know the specifics of the Morecambe case, although I did speak to Tanya Ellsworth, who was chair of the Supporters Trust there. I think as well, though, part of Morecambe's problem, I got a bit of criticism for Morecambe fans for saying this, but I do think part of it, again, was that overspending in pursuit of success. Maybe not overspending in terms of transfer fees, but overspending in terms of wages, because nobody wants to be the club that got relegated. Nobody wants to be the club that didn't get promoted.
Mhm.
So that's, I mean, that's why I'd argue, we need a regulator and we need some kind of financial control in football, because unless we get it, I mean, what happens, and I'm sure this has happened over the years at Burnley, is that we get this great cry, don't we? We need a new owner. And what do we mean by we need a new owner? We want a sugar daddy. We want somebody to pile in millions of pounds to our football club, to spend money on transfers and money on wages. And I kind of think we need to refashion football. I think we
Mm.
need to look beyond that, beyond looking for that. Again, I'm drawn to religious phrases. It's your fault, but drawn to looking beyond a saviour for our football club. I think truly, I think that fans can run football clubs. And I think if we all ran them on a level footing and we accepted that we're not all going to be successful every season, but simply being there is the great thing, I think football would be a lot healthier as a result.
And you talked there about Adrian about legislation of clubs. What about legislation of footballers themselves? A couple of things that in recent weeks that have
Mm,
disturbed me. One is a Burnley link is Josh Brownhill, who was Player of the Year, leading goal scorer, who's gone to I can barely remember what they're called, Shabab FC, I think they're called,
mm.
reportedly on £100,000 a week. And from the player's perspective, I get that. He's an
Mm.
opportunity there to go and make his life secure forever and a day.
Yeah.
But actually, what a waste of a talented footballer. What a waste of a really top-notch guy
Mm.
who had offers in the Premier League, who had a wonderful contract offered to him from Burnley, has
Yes.
has gone.
Yes.
That's the first one, and the second one is uh, Isak at Newcastle. How
Yeah.
he can just down tools effectively.
Yes.
I'm a bit disturbed by both those. I'd be really interested to know your thoughts.
Yeah. Taking the Isak one first, I think, as a fan, you think that's pretty rotten, don't you? And we've probably all had it. I think because it involved Liverpool and Newcastle to an extent, who are such a successful club, or such a well-supported club, and Isak had a great season. It's kind of magnified, isn't it, in that whole world of the Premier League. But I'm sure we've all had it. You've had it probably at Burnley, even, when you've been lower down the leagues. We've had it at West Brom, and it turns your stomach, doesn't it? And you boo the player when they come back and all that. But I don't know really what happens. I think it's I don't know how you legislate for that, I suppose, because you don't really want to be saying to a footballer, if you've down tools, you're going to be suspended for the next year. I think that would be cruel. I think one of the unacknowledged aspects of the way that the transfer system works is the psychology, is the mental health state of the player. And we had a player at West Brom, really talented young player called Saido Berahino. I don't know if you remember Berahino. And West Brom were open to selling him to Spurs. He was an England under 21 international, had been called up to England's squads. Spurs wanted to buy him for 25 million, which sounded like a great fee for a homegrown youngster. But our chairman at the time, Jeremy Peace, and Daniel Levy at Spurs were both known to drive a hard bargain, shall we say. And I think Spurs wanted to stage the transfer over a number of years and also build in various incentives to it so that we weren't getting 25 million quid, certainly not up front. And so we didn't sell Berahino. And again, I speak just as a fan. I've got no special insight into Berahino's personal life, but I think his head went at that point. He's been pulled from pillar to post. You've got your chance to join a big club, and then it's taken away from you. And Tony Pulis, who was our manager at the time, was very good with Berahino, put his arm around his shoulder, tried to encourage him and nurture him, but he was never the same player again. So I do think you've got to take into account the mental health of a footballer, even if you might feel from the outside they're in the wrong because they're under contract. If there's a chance to really make it in your career, and you'd say most of us would say Isak's at Newcastle is at a great club, but they're not a great club in terms of winning trophies and competing regularly in the Champions League like Liverpool are. So, he sees Liverpool at a different level to Newcastle. So I think it's unfortunate. But I think truthfully, if you've got a player who's higher than the level that you are, you might want to try and keep them. You can try and persuade them, but ultimately, if they want to go, they go. The Josh Brownhill one, I agree with you. I think it's sad. And I just think the reality is that, all of us have a duty to kind of feed our family, don't we? And I know I suspect Brownhill probably would never have gone short, even had he stayed in the Premier League and had a very good contract. We live perhaps in a world that values material possessions rather too much. And but again, you can't really be critical of another human being for taking that choice, even if it's not one that we would take ourselves, really. But I agree with you, it's a waste. And it was quite instructive for me. We had a West Brom player called Mateus Pereira, brilliant footballer, one of the most gifted players we've had in recent times. And he went off to Saudi. And he only lasted there a season and a bit. And then he went back to Brazil, which is where his heritage is, although I think he was Portuguese with Brazilian heritage. And now he's playing for Cruzeiro and playing for the Brazilian national team. So, maybe Brownhill will be back sooner rather than later.
We'll see. And so just give us a bit more context to the book, Adrian. It's coming out in the autumn, isn't it?
Oh, it's out now.
It's out now.
Look,
It's out now.
here we go. For those of you watching this, not just listening, there it is. Look, beautiful gold cover. Bit too close to Wolves colours for my liking. Where's the money gone? The battle for the soul of English football. And that was occasioned by some of these conversations that we've been having, Alex, about the money in football and what players do. But this all came home to roost to me a couple of years ago when, having reported on this stuff since the mid-'80s when I was a fanzine writer, I know I hear you say, but you look far too young. I do, Alex, but, that's the way things are. I wrote a fanzine in the mid-'80s called Off the Ball, And West Brom at that time were not in trouble, but I was really concerned about how amongst our local teams in here in the West Midlands, where I'm speaking from, Wolves were owned by people who we were told were Saudi Arabians and linked to the Saudi royal family. Were in fact a couple of businessmen from Manchester called the Batty brothers, and their plan didn't go well. They had a plan to develop a big parcel of land next to Molineux, and they didn't get planning permission. And the logistics of football, then as now, were against them, and it ended up with two sides of the ground being closed. The local council having to bail them out by buying the stadium, and dare I say, West Brom fans like myself having to dip our hands into our pockets with bucket collections to help save Wolves. And Walsall, who were one of my local teams as well, had an issue where their owner wanted to, who also owned Birmingham City, wanted to move Walsall to Birmingham. He was a scrap metal dealer. I've no idea what his plans were for Walsall Stadium, but I think you can put two and two together. So, you know, that provoked me in the 80s. And then as a journalist over the years, I've moved from fanzine writer, work now still for the BBC as an investigative journalist, and whenever I can, I've reported on football. But then at the end of 2023, this all came home to us at the Hawthorns when our owners were clearly unable to keep the club financially stable. And as a fan group, we started protesting. So I just wanted to kind of follow my own personal journey as a fan over that 40 years, but also try and understand what had happened to football during that time, how it had changed, and the forces from both in the UK but also abroad that had changed football, so that my own club, which was owned by Chinese people who never came to the ground, were now placing the future of my club in jeopardy. So I wanted to follow that story. But what I will say, Alex, is that it's a book about fan stories like my own. I'm not an accountant. I'm not Kieran Maguire. Love him though I do. I'm not an accountant. I don't know one end of a spreadsheet from another. So this is about fan stories and partly about the power of fans at like Blackpool and AFC Wimbledon and Northampton Town to rescue their clubs, and also about the weakness of fans in the face of the wealth of the likes of Abramovich and of oil states who've increasingly become involved in English football.
Mm. Well, it sounds great. I was just been talking. I was thinking about Wool. You know, some great links there. I had Simon Garner on the Godcast,
Oh,
who
yeah.
West Brom legend, no doubt.
Yes, yeah. Once saw him get sent off away at Blackburn Rovers. Did I mention that name? Away at and for fighting with his own teammate Martin Bennett on a rain-lashed night at Ewood Park, pre-Jack Walker. The two of them sent off. Nine-man Albion hammered 3-0. Thanks, guys. But he was a legend, was he? A man. It was. Is it true that he once had a little drag of a cigarette whilst on a football field?
Well, do you know what? Although I've proclaimed to be a huge Burnley fan, I grew up a huge Spurs fan because I was born down there, and I never actually refereed on Turf Moor, but quite often I was the fourth official at reserve matches, and
Okay.
on this occasion, you rang the bell, and the coaches were coming in the dressing room, and Keith Birkinshire walked in, and I was like, not usually starstruck, but I was completely starstruck by him, and Simon Garner's career was going that badly. He was on the bench for the reserves for West Brom. And afterwards, he didn't recall this when we did the podcast, but I remember him in the walking round to the players' lounge together, and he was then having a crafty cigarette there, but he is what a character, and he tells some wonderful stories. So if anybody wants to check out that, just check out Simon Garner on the Godcast. But Adrian, good luck with the book. I'm not sure you need it.
No,
Get your
well,
book
I
up. Let's
do
see it
need it.
again. I'll get
If,
mine
if,
out. This is my book here, Our Daily Bread. All
Daily
Goes to the
Bread,
Altar.
yeah. Well, this is mine here. We're
Oh,
having a
look.
book off. We're
Yeah.
having a book off. And you can get mine, by the way. Where's the money gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football through Byline Books.
Okay, and that's where that's your podcast link as well, isn't it? Quickly, just promote your own podcast, Adrian.
Oh yeah, so I did. Well, I'll do a few. I did, Where's the Money Gone? Which is kind of different from the book. I do that with Charlie Methven, who some people may remember, wearing salmon pink trousers. He's the old Etonian who was a director at Sunderland, but gives us great insight from the boardroom into football. So that's Where's the Money Gone podcast, and I also make the podcast a political podcast for the Byline Times as well. So, and I work for Radio 4, File on 4 Investigates. So here, there, and everywhere, Alex. Here, there, and everywhere.
Great. Well, Adrian, it's been great to get you on. It's been lovely chatting football, not and just recounting some of those old days. And good luck with everything. Thanks for coming on.
Great to speak to you, Alex. Thanks so much for the invite. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.